November 8, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. 6:42 a.m. The German machine gun nest died in 3 bursts before its crew understood they were under fire. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kutcher watched through a makeshift 4-power scope mounted atop his Browning automatic rifle as the first gunner's head snapped back. The second man's chest erupted in a spray of red mist, and the third scrambled for cover that no longer existed at 370 yards. The bar bucked against Kutcher's shoulder with his familiar rhythm, but the killing was different now. Precise. Surgical. No longer the suppressive fire doctrine that training manuals prescribed, but aimed shots delivered with rifle accuracy from a weapon that fired 20 rounds per minute. The German position went silent. Kutcher's squad advanced through the fog-shrouded trees without taking a single casualty. And somewhere in the shattered pillboxes and frozen foxholes of the Hürtgen, word began spreading among Wehrmacht defenders about an American weapon they called the hunter cannon, an automatic rifle that killed like a sniper but fired like a machine gun. The Browning automatic rifle had entered American service in 1918, designed by John Browning as a portable automatic weapon that could accompany infantry advances across no man's land. It fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the Springfield rifle, but delivered it in semi-automatic or fully automatic modes from a 20-round detachable magazine. The bar was heavy, 19.4 pounds loaded, and awkward for sustained automatic fire, but it provided squads with immediate firepower that could suppress enemy positions while riflemen maneuvered. By World War II, the bar had become the backbone of American infantry tactics, with 1 or 2 assigned to each 12-man squad. Doctrine prescribed using the weapon for area suppression and covering fire, hosing down suspected enemy positions with bursts that kept defenders pinned while riflemen closed distance or flanked. But Raymond Kutcher had never followed doctrine strictly. He grew up in the Montana backcountry, learning to hunt elk and deer in terrain where shots frequently exceeded 400 yards and ammunition was expensive enough that missing meant going hungry. His father taught him to make every round count, to understand ballistics and wind deflection, to shoot from improvised positions that field manuals never covered. When Kutcher was drafted in 1942, he scored expert marksman on every qualification, range despite never having fired a military weapon before basic training. His instructors noticed his talent and tried routing him to sniper school, but Kutcher washed out during the psychological evaluation phase. The evaluators said he lacked the temperament for solitary work, that his personality required team integration rather than independent operation. So Kutcher was assigned to a standard rifle company and eventually became a bar gunner because he was strong enough to carry the weapon and calm enough to use it effectively under fire. He hated it at first. The bar's iron sights were crude compared to the precise apertures on the Springfield he had qualified with. The weapon's weight and recoil made accurate shooting difficult beyond 200 yards. And the doctrine of spraying bullets downrange violated everything his father had taught him about marksmanship and ammunition conservation. Kutcher watched other bar gunners burn through magazines in seconds, hitting nothing but trees and dirt, then calling for more ammunition, while riflemen did the actual killing. It seemed wasteful, inefficient, contrary to the weapon's potential. The bar was mechanically capable of precision. Its gas-operated action was smooth. Its barrel was well made. Its trigger could be controlled with practice. But nobody used it that way because iron sights and automatic fire doctrine did not encourage precision. The idea of mounting an optical scope on the bar came to Kutcher in October 1944, during a lull in fighting outside Aachen. His squad had been pinned by a German sniper working from a church steeple 800 yards distant. American counter-sniper teams eventually eliminated the threat, but not before 2 men were killed and 4 wounded. Kutcher had watched through binoculars as the German worked, noting his disciplined fire pattern and careful position selection. The sniper was using a Scope Car 98K, probably a 4X or 6X optic, that allowed precise shooting at ranges where American infantry with iron sights were nearly helpless. Kutcher's bar could reach that distance ballistically. The .30-06 cartridge had effective range beyond 800 yards, but hitting a human-sized target at that distance with iron sights was nearly impossible. He needed magnification. He needed a scope. Military regulations prohibited modifying issued weapons without armor approval, But Kutcher had learned that regulations in combat zones were flexible when soldiers showed initiative that improved combat effectiveness. He approached his platoon sergeant, a pragmatic veteran named Mike Torino, who cared more about results than procedures. Kutcher explained his idea. Mount an optical scope on his bar to enable precision shooting at mid-range distances where iron sights were inadequate but where the weapon's ballistics were still effective. Torino asked what kind of scope Kutcher planned to use. Kutcher said he would find one. Torino told him that if he managed to acquire a scope and could demonstrate improved effectiveness, the platoon would support the modification. But if it degraded the weapon's reliability or Kutcher's combat performance, he would strip the scope immediately and face consequences for damaging military property. Finding an optical scope in a combat zone proved easier than Kutcher expected. The American military issued scoped Springfield rifles to designated marksmen, and battlefield losses meant spare scopes occasionally circulated through informal supply networks. Kutcher traded 3 bottles of captured German cognac and a Luger pistol to an ordnance sergeant who had pulled a 4X Weaver scope from a damaged rifle. The scope was intended for bolt-action weapons with different mounting systems in the bar, but Kutcher fabricated a rail adapter using scrap metal and a drill press at a field workshop. The improvised mount was crude, held in place by machine screws tapped directly into bar's receiver, but it was solid enough to maintain zero through normal handling. The real challenge was zeroing the weapon. The bar was designed for automatic fire from the shoulder or bipod, not for precision shooting from supported positions. Its recoil pattern in semi-automatic mode was manageable, but different from bolt-action rifles Kutcher had experience with. He spent an afternoon firing single shots at varying distances, adjusting the scope's elevation and windage knobs, learning how the weapon's harmonics affected bullet trajectory. By sunset on October 24th, he could consistently hit man-sized targets at 350 yards, grouping shots within an 8-inch circle. At 200 yards, his groups tightened to 4 inches. The accuracy was not sniper grade, but it was revolutionary for a weapon designed to spray suppressive fire. Kutcher's squad leader, Corporal Danny Holbrook, watched the zeroing session with skeptical interest. Holbrook was a Chicago native with no hunting background. Skeptical of Kutcher's Montana rifle culture, and unconvinced that precision shooting mattered when doctrine emphasized firepower and maneuver. He asked what tactical advantage Kutcher's scope bar provided that a regular bar or designated marksman with a scoped Springfield could not deliver. Kutcher explained that the combination of optical precision and semi-automatic fire created a capability neither weapon alone possessed. A scoped Springfield could achieve better accuracy, but required working the bolt between shots, limiting engagement speed against multiple targets. A standard bar could deliver rapid fire, but lacked precision to effectively engage targets beyond 200 yards. The scope bar split the difference, offering accuracy sufficient for deliberate shots at mid-range distances, while retaining the magazine capacity and semi-automatic action to engage multiple threats without reloading. Holbrook remained unconvinced until November 8th, when Kutcher used a scope bar to eliminate the German machine gun position that opened this account. The tactical situation had been deteriorating rapidly that morning. Kutcher's platoon was advancing through dense forest toward a German defensive line anchored by multiple MG-42 positions. American doctrine for assault machine gun nests involved suppressive fire from bars, while rifle squads maneuvered to flanking positions. But the Hürtgen terrain made flanking nearly impossible. The forest was too dense, the undergrowth too thick, the German field of fire too well planned. Previous assaults had failed with heavy casualties. Kutcher's platoon was preparing for another frontal push when fog rolled through the trees, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards for everyone without optical magnification. But Kutcher had his scope. While his squad mates saw only gray murk and vague tree shapes, Kutcher could resolve individual soldiers and defensive positions through the 4X magnification. He spotted the German machine gun nest 370 yards ahead, partially concealed behind a fallen log, but clearly visible through his optic. The crew was preparing to fire, loading a fresh ammunition belt and adjusting their weapons traverse. Kutcher dropped prone, braced the bar against a tree root, and aligned the scope's crosshairs on the gunner's upper chest. He fired 3 rounds in semi-automatic, reacquiring his sight picture between shots. All 3 hit. The gunner collapsed. Kutcher shifted aim to the assistant gunner scrambling to take over the weapon. 2 more rounds. Both hit center mass. The German fell across his dead comrade. The 3rd crew member broke and ran. Kutcher led him with the crosshairs. Squeezed the trigger once more. The man went down 40 yards from the position. Elapsed time, 11 seconds. 3 enemy killed at a distance where American infantry normally could not even see targets clearly, let alone hit them with precision fire. Holbrook stared at Kutcher for 3 seconds after the shooting stopped, then ordered the squad forward. They advanced through the fog without encountering resistance, passing the dead German machine gunners whose bodies were still warm when American soldiers reached their position. Holbrook examined the wounds, tight grouping, all within the kill zone, no wild shots or misses evident. He looked back at Kutcher, who was reloading his bar with a fresh magazine, and said that the scoped weapon had just saved every man in the squad. He also said that Kutcher needed to teach everyone else how to shoot like that, because if one scope bar could neutralize prepared defenses, multiple scope bars could change how the company fought. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the battalion. Officers who had ignored Kutcher's improvised modification suddenly wanted demonstrations and tactical assessments. By November 10th, Kutcher was conducting informal training sessions for other bar gunners, explaining scope use, range estimation, and precision shooting techniques. Most struggled to replicate his accuracy. Years of hunting experience and natural marksmanship talent were not easily transferred through a few hours of instruction, but even mediocre shooters showed dramatic improvement over standard bar iron sight performance. A gunner who previously could not reliably hit man-sized targets beyond 150 yards could now engage effectively at 250 yards. The difference was sufficient to justify acquiring more scopes and mounting them on additional bars. But scopes were scarce. The military had not anticipated using optical sights on automatic weapons, so procurement systems did not supply them in quantities needed to equip multiple bars per company. Innovative soldiers found alternative sources. Some pulled scopes from captured German rifles. Others fabricated improvised optics using magnifying lenses scavenged from binoculars or rangefinders. A few entrepreneurial supply sergeants discovered crates of scopes intended for sniper rifles and redirected them to bar gunners who demonstrated competence with magnified shooting. By late November, an estimated 40 scope bars were operating in the Hürtgen Forest sector, concentrated in units that had seen Kutcher's demonstrations or heard about the tactical advantages. The German response emerged gradually. Initial encounters with scope bars were interpreted as sniper fire, which German doctrine had well-established countermeasures for. But as more engagements occurred, patterns became apparent that did not fit sniper profiles. The fire was too rapid, too sustained, too willing to engage multiple targets in quick succession. Snipers worked alone, took single shots, prioritized concealment, and escape over volume of fire. These new American shooters operated differently, embedded with assault squads, firing multiple rounds per engagement, shifting between precision shots and suppressive bursts depending on tactical requirements. German after-action reports began describing a new American weapon, initially called the automatic sharpshooter rifle in formal communications, but quickly nicknamed Jägerkanone, the hunter cannon, by frontline troops. The nickname captured the weapon's perceived characteristics. Hunter referenced a deliberate, aimed shooting that characterized its use, reminiscent of hunting rather than conventional suppressive fire. Cannon acknowledged the weapon's intimidating firepower and the psychological impact of being hit with precision fire from an automatic weapon. German soldiers were accustomed to taking cover from machine gun bursts or avoiding sniper hides, but the scope bar created a tactical problem their training did not adequately address. Taking cover from area fire meant finding any concealment, but taking cover from precision fire required hard cover that could stop bullets. The scope bar forced offenders to assume every position was under aimed fire, degrading their ability to maneuver or return effective fire. Kutcher's second significant engagement with the scope bar occurred on November 19th during an assault on a fortified German position near the village of Kleinhau. His company was tasked with clearing a network of bunkers and trenches that had stalled the American advance for 3 days. Previous attacks had been repulsed with heavy casualties by interlocking fields of machine gun fire and accurate mortar strikes directed by German observers in elevated positions. Kutcher's platoon was assigned to neutralize the observers before the main assault began, a mission that normally would have required dedicated sniper teams operating hours in advance. But sniper teams were scarce, and the tactical timeline did not allow for extensive preparation. Kutcher positioned himself in a partially collapsed barn 400 yards from the German observation post, a concrete structure built into a hillside with narrow vision slits facing the American approach routes. The distance was beyond effective iron sight range for most infantry weapons, but well within the scope bar's capability. Kutcher waited until German observers appeared at the vision slits, identifiable by the binoculars they used to scan American positions. He fired 6 rounds in 3 two-shot bursts, aiming at the dark rectangles of the vision slits where observers' heads would be positioned. He could not see his impacts clearly at that range, but he knew his elevation and windage were correct from previous zeroing. The German observation post went silent. No more mortar fire adjusted onto American positions. The assault proceeded with significantly fewer casualties than previous attempts. After the position was captured, Kutcher's company commander, Captain Harold Jensen, inspected the observation post personally. He found 2 dead German observers inside, both killed by .30-06 rounds that had entered the vision slits and struck them in the head or upper torso. Jensen, a West Point graduate with rigid views about proper military equipment, had initially opposed Kutcher's scope modification as unauthorized tinkering that violated regulations. But faced with evidence that the scope bar had accomplished a mission that would have otherwise required specialized assets or costly frontal assault, Jensen reversed his position. He authorized procurement of scopes for all bar gunners in the company and directed that Kutcher's shooting techniques be incorporated into company training protocols. The tactical implications extended beyond individual engagements. Scope bars changed how American infantry approached defensive positions. Standard doctrine assumed that suppressing enemy fire required volume, multiple weapons firing continuously to keep defenders unable to effectively return fire or maneuver. This approach worked but consumed enormous ammunition and often failed to actually kill defenders who could simply wait out the suppression and resume fighting once American fire slackened. Scope bars enabled a different approach. Precision fire that killed or wounded defenders rather than merely suppressing them, delivered from distances where those defenders could not effectively return fire with iron-sighted weapons. A single skilled bar gunner with a scope could neutralize multiple defensive positions sequentially, systematically dismantling prepared defenses without requiring the massive ammunition expenditure or close-range assaults that characterize conventional tactics. German forces adapted by altering their defensive construction. Vision slits were made smaller and fitted with angled steel baffles that deflected incoming fire. Observation posts were positioned deeper behind front lines, beyond the practical range of scope bars. Machine gun positions were designed with overhead cover and indirect fire ports that prevented direct fire engagements from most approach angles. These adaptations reduced the scope bar's effectiveness, but required German engineers to invest significant labor in fortification improvements that would have been unnecessary against standard American small arms. The modifications also made defensive positions more constrictive and limited defender visibility, creating different tactical vulnerabilities that American forces exploited. Kutcher's reputation grew beyond his immediate unit. By December 1944, he was being requested for missions that required eliminating specific high-value targets at mid-range distances. One such mission involved a German artillery observer who had been directing fire against American supply routes from position in a heavily damaged church tower. The observer was too far for standard infantry weapons, but too mobile and well-protected for counter-battery fire to be effective. Kutcher was tasked with the elimination. He positioned himself in a building 620 yards from the church, waited 4 hours for the observer to appear an opening in the damaged tower wall, and fired a single shot that struck the German in the chest. The artillery fire ceased. The supply route reopened. Kutcher returned to his unit without fanfare, another mission accomplished with minimal ammunition expenditure and no friendly casualties. But the psychological toll was accumulating. Kutcher was not a sniper by training or temperament, yet the scope bar pushed him into roles that resembled sniping more than traditional infantry combat. He was killing men at distances where he could see their faces through the scope, could watch them fall, could observe the aftermath of his shots in detail that iron sights never provided. The magnification that made him effective also made the killing intimate in ways that standard combat was not. Kutcher began having difficulty sleeping, seeing the faces of German soldiers he had killed, questioning whether the efficiency of his shooting made it more or less morally defensible than the anonymous violence of area suppression fire. He spoke about this once to the battalion chaplain, a thoughtful man named Father Malone who had seen enough combat to understand what soldiers faced. Kutcher asked if killing with precision was ethically different from killing with spray fire, whether seeing your target clearly through a scope made you more responsible for their death than shooting blindly into suspected positions. Father Malone said that killing was killing, that the moral weight was the same regardless of method, but that Kutcher's question revealed a conscience that many soldiers lost. He told Kutcher that the efficiency of his shooting likely saved both American and German lives by ending engagements quickly rather than prolonging them with extended firefights. He also told Kutcher that carrying the psychological burden of that efficiency was the price of being good at killing, and that the burden proved Kutcher had not lost his humanity to the war. The conversation helped, but the weight remained. Kutcher continued using the scope bar because it kept his squad mate alive, because it accomplished missions with minimal casualties, because refusing to use his skills would have been a greater moral failure than accepting the psychological cost. But he stopped volunteering for special missions, stopped seeking opportunities to demonstrate his marksmanship, stopped taking pride in the reputation he had built. He simply did what was necessary and tried not to think too deeply about the faces in his scope. The Hürtgen Forest campaign ended in mid-December with devastating casualties on both sides and minimal territorial gains. Kutcher's company had been reduced to less than half strength, the survivors exhausted and psychologically shattered by months of close-quarters forest combat. The scope bar had proven tactically valuable, but no individual weapon could offset the fundamental strategic futility of the battle. Kutcher survived physically unharmed, but emotionally hollowed, carrying a scope bar not as a symbol of innovation, but as a reminder how efficiently war could be waged by men who became very good at killing. After the Hürtgen, Kutcher's unit was pulled back for rest and refit. The scope bar modifications that spread through his battalion during the forest fighting were now being evaluated by higher command for potential standardization. Ordnance officers conducted tests comparing scoped and iron-sighted bars, measuring accuracy improvements, assessing tactical applications, and evaluating whether the modification should be officially adopted. The tests confirmed what Kutcher had demonstrated in combat. Optical sights dramatically improved bar effectiveness at ranges beyond 200 yards, transforming the weapon from a close-range suppression tool into a precision mid-range platform capable of engaging targets that previously required dedicated marksman rifles. But official adoption never occurred. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time procurement systems could have produced scope bars in quantity, the war in Europe was ending. The weapon that German soldiers had feared as a hunter cannon remained a field improvisation, used by individual gunners who had the initiative to modify their weapons and the skill to employ them effectively. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, most scope bars were returned to standard configuration, the improvised mounts removed, the scopes redistributed to sniper rifles or stored in armories. The innovation that had changed how some American units fought disappeared from service almost as quickly as it had emerged. Kutcher came home to Montana in October 1945. His scope bar left behind in a European arms depot, his shooting skills intact but unwanted in civilian life. He did not hunt for 3 years after returning, could not bring himself to look through a rifle scope without seeing German faces instead of elk or deer. When he finally did hunt again, it was with iron sights only, deliberately limiting his effective range to distances where targets were vague shapes rather than clear images. He never spoke publicly about his war experiences, never mentioned the scope bar or the nickname German soldiers had given it, never explained why he refused to use optical sights despite being one of the most naturally talented riflemen in his county. His service records contain only basic information: Staff Sergeant Raymond Kutcher, bar gunner, European theater, honorably discharged. No mention of the scope modification, the tactical innovations, the missions accomplished, or the reputation he had built among both American soldiers and German defenders. The closest acknowledgement appears in his company's after-action reports from November and December 1944, brief references to effective mid-range fire support and designated marksman engagement protocols that hint at Kutcher's contributions without naming him or describing the scope bar specifically. The German documentation is more revealing. Post-war analysis of captured Wehrmacht records includes multiple references to the Jägerkanone, describing it as an American automatic rifle with optical sighting that created significant tactical challenges for defensive operations. One particularly detailed report from a German regiment that fought in Hürtgen notes that the weapon combines the rapid-fire capability of a machine rifle with precision of a sharpshooter weapon, creating engagements at ranges where our forces cannot effectively respond with standard infantry arms. Recommended countermeasures include improved fortification design, elimination of vision slits larger than 5 centimeters, and positioning of defensive works beyond 400 meters from anticipated American approach routes. The report's author noted that these countermeasures were resource-intensive and not always practical, implicitly acknowledging that the scope bar had created a problem German forces could not fully solve. The weapon's legacy survived primarily through unofficial channels. Veterans who had seen Kutcher shoot or who had used scope bars themselves occasionally mentioned the modification in reunion conversations or informal histories. A few gunsmiths who had military experience began offering scope mounting services for civilian bar owners in the 1950s, though the weapons were expensive and relatively rare in civilian markets. Military historians researching American infantry tactics occasionally encounter references to scope bars in unit records, but usually dismiss them as minor field improvisations not significant enough to warrant detailed study. The concept of mounting optical sights on automatic weapons was eventually vindicated when militaries worldwide began issuing optical sights as standard equipment for infantry rifles in the late 20th century. Modern designated marksman rifles combine semi-automatic fire with magnified optics, providing exactly the capability Kutcher had improvised in 1944. But the doctrinal path from Kutcher's scope bar to modern designated marksman systems was not direct or acknowledged. The innovation was rediscovered multiple times by different militaries, each believing they were pioneering new tactical approaches rather than reviving concepts proven 70 years earlier in German forests. Kutcher died in 1998, age 76, having lived a quiet life raising cattle on the same Montana land where his father had taught him to shoot. His obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence. The scope bar was not mentioned. The nickname Hunter Cannon was not mentioned. His widow donated his military records and medals to the local historical society, where they were cataloged and filed alongside hundreds of other veterans' materials. The society's curator noted that Kutcher had been a bar gunner, but did not recognize the significance of that role or the innovations Kutcher had pioneered. In 2003, a military researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Warren was studying American small arms modifications during World War II when she encountered references to scope bars in multiple unit records from the Hürtgen Forest campaign. Intrigued, she began tracing the modification's origins and discovered Kutcher's name in several after-action reports and veteran interviews. She attempted to contact him for an oral history interview, not knowing he had died 5 years earlier. His widow provided access to his personal papers, which included a journal Kutcher had kept sporadically during the war. The journal contained technical notes about scope zeroing, range estimation, and shooting techniques, along with reflections on the psychological weight of precision killing that revealed depths of moral struggle Kutcher had never shared with his family. Warren published her findings in a military history journal article titled Precision Innovation, Scoped Automatic Rifles in the European Theater, 1944 to 1945. The article documented how soldiers like Kutcher had independently developed tactical capabilities that formal doctrine did not envision, creating improvised solutions to battlefield problems using available materials and personal expertise. Warren argued that military innovation frequently occurred at the lowest tactical levels, driven by soldiers who understood combat realities better than distant planners, and that institutional resistance to field modifications often delayed adoption of effective innovations by years or decades. The article received modest attention in military history circles, but did not penetrate broader public consciousness. The scope bar remained a footnote, an interesting detail about soldiers improvising solutions, not a transformative development that reshaped warfare. But for the men who had fought alongside Kutcher, who had watched him kill with precision from distances they could barely see, The scope bar was more than a footnote. It was a weapon that kept them alive, that changed how their unit fought, that earned respect and fear from enemies who called it the hunter cannon, because facing it meant facing death delivered with hunter's patience and cannon's finality. The last known example of a World War II-era scope bar was discovered in a French attic in 2011, apparently kept as a souvenir by an American veteran who never returned home. The weapon's improvised scope mount was still attached. The optic itself was missing, but the mounting holes drilled into the receiver told the story of field modification performed under combat conditions. The bar was donated to a military museum, where it now sits in a display case with a placard explaining that some American soldiers modified their weapons with optical sights during World War II. The placard does not mention Kutcher's name, does not describe the tactical innovations as modification enabled, does not reference the German nickname that acknowledged the weapon's effectiveness. It is simply an artifact, interesting but not apparently significant. Its full story lost of visitors who see only an old rifle with unusual holes drilled in its metal. But the story persists in scattered archives and fading memories, in the journal Kutcher left behind, and the German reports that describe the Jägerkanone with mixture of respect and fear, in the knowledge that ordinary soldiers solving immediate problems sometimes pioneer capabilities that formal research and development never anticipate. The scope bar was not the weapon that won World War II, but it was a weapon that showed how precision and firepower could combine, how optical sights could transform existing platforms, how tactical innovation emerged from necessity rather than planning. Kutcher's contribution was never officially recognized, never rewarded with medals or commendations specifically acknowledging his innovation. He remained a staff sergeant, a bar gunner, one of thousands who served and survived and came home to resume interrupted lives. But in the forest where he fought, in engagements where his scope bar turned tactical situations that should have been costly into victories achieved with minimal casualties, in the German defenders who learned to fear an automatic rifle that killed like a sniper, his innovation left marks that outlasted his anonymity. The hunter cannon existed because one Montana rifleman refused to accept that doctrine-defined capability, because he trusted his skills enough to modify his weapon despite regulations, because he understood that war rewarded effectiveness over compliance. Subscribe for more untold stories from the wars that shaped our world.